I had a bad asthma attack which landed me in the hospital. They gave me something which seemed a lot like the general anesthesia I was given for 2 surgeries later in life. It helped me to breathe, but I was tired, slipped away to sleep, and stopped breathing. I felt the sensation of some time passing. I also felt as though I was dreaming of seeing someone in a bed who was surrounded by doctors. But there was a strange physical sensation as well, which is hard to describe. It troubled me, and I could not wake from this dream. I was floating above a person and didn't make the cognitive connection at first, that this was my body. I could see my mother in the corner of the room and became worried for her. It was about this time when I realized this was not a dream, that I just wanted to go home. The next thing I knew, it was nighttime. I was outside the house and looking in the kitchen window. I could not get inside the house, and I couldn't attract the attention of my family inside. This horrified me, and some time passed. I was wandering around in the dark and eventually found others who were similarly confused as to where we were and what was going on. This is hard to explain, but we didn't really have a physical presence. I remember getting to know and understand these people as we were all going through the same experience together. It was like we were in a group and the lights were turned off. We knew that we were all still there but could not see one another. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. Some time passed here as well, but I was determined to find a way out for all of us, which was probably absurd since I didn't know where we were. From here on, all linearity kind of ends. I remember things, but it's like they all happened at once. Time ceased to exist. People have asked me if I remember a tunnel, and my answer is no, not exactly. There was a light, kind of dim and from a distance. The light got closer and more intense. I felt a love that brings tears to me as I write this. I wanted so much to go back and bring all of the others with me to this place, but I didn't really have control of it. As wonderful and amazing as this place felt, I was pretty much along for the ride. I don't know how much of this I can put into words to accurately describe. The light was love and understanding. It was outside of me, through me, and in me. It was home. I've never felt a love like this since, though there have been very brief moments of kindness and acceptance that I just live for. It's hard to see the computer screen for the tears in my eyes. I want so much to use all my will to reach back and pull those people in the darkness here to just be here, but I don't know how. It's hard for me to describe what happened next. It was as if something else inside me was speaking in a strange language, but I understood it to be a recounting of this and past lives, kind of like an introduction to someone else. There was a life review where it was like a reliving of certain moments in my life up to this point. I felt with complete clarity how I felt and how the other person felt through my actions, my words, and my thoughts. These were times when I probably should have acted differently, used better judgment, not gotten caught up in the emotion. This was a very humbling experience. To think I had only been here 7 years in this life, it concerns me what the next one will be like, because although I'm more aware of how I affect those around me, I still get emotional, I still screw up, and I'm well aware that this experience has not made me perfect. Maybe more aware of how imperfect I am more than anything else, but it has not prevented me from being stupid, insensitive, egotistical, and uncaring. If anything, it has driven home the point of trying to be more mindful, but all the while realizing that I'm far from perfect, and it's something that requires constant effort and attention. At a certain point, I met someone who seemed to be there to assist me in deciding whether I should come back in this life or start all over in another. I would call this person my guide, and although I'm not really aware of them having a physical presence, I felt a feminine energy about them. I wanted to know more about them in this place I was in, but it was clear that this experience was not about them. It was more like going to a guidance counselor. I was young, but emotionally invested in the people of this life. Starting over and not really knowing what that would be like was hard for me to accept. I was shown parts of my future life, like going up to a screen and suddenly being in the moment and experiencing it. It was as though I were there at that moment, feeling how I would feel at that time. I was shown parts of my future in this life if I choose to go on. You would think I could predict the future with what I was shown, yet it could be due to the fact that I don't deal with detailed information really well. I tend to look at the global perspective and see the forest but not the trees. But there was a clarity there in that place which doesn't seem to exist for me here. It was simple to understand so much more than I can here. Although I do get feelings about people and things here once in a while, it's not like I remember feeling there. As these moments unfolded in my life here after this NDE, there would be a sense of familiarity about some things. Sometimes it can be about people, even though I had not met them before. The things I was shown have been more like choices that were made when the options were fairly limited. The feeling at the time of the choice was simply, this feels right. This feels like the right thing to do. With that feeling is a sense of peace and calm. I was told that if I were to continue in this life, that it would be unlikely that I would reach my potential. However, it seemed clear that starting over was a wild card, and I was not shown anything about that. I remember meeting other people, and I get the feeling that these were people who had lived here and were there to help me decide what to do. I was shown details of my future that I don't feel really comfortable divulging here. Some things were embarrassing. There was a total and complete clarity there, and it had nothing to do with my sense of self or ego, but everything to do with what I came into this life to do, to learn, and to experience and grow. I can see that I am running out of room here, so I will cut it short. When I return to my body, I really miss that place, and I still think about it today. We are here to grow as spiritual beings and to experience certain things. I remember things from before and during my birth. I remember choosing my parents for their personality and kindness. On a certain level, I'm pretty sure I chose to have asthma to keep me from making the mistakes of another life. I may have chosen my NDE to keep me aware of why I'm here. In August of 1989, I was bicycling home from a volunteer position around 10 p.m. I was coming up on a light and I was hit from behind by a pickup truck traveling at approximately 50 miles per hour. The bike and I were slammed against the truck. As the driver slammed on the brakes, I was catapulted 60 feet through the air to land on the shoulder of the road. My lungs collapsed, most of my internal organs ruptured, and I broke my pelvis and several ribs. I was pretty close to roadkill. Fortunately, a police officer was nearby and able to radio for an ambulance quickly. I, as I know myself, have no memory of the preceding events. This is what I remember. One moment I was riding my bike, and the next I was in a place of complete darkness. I had no sense of direction or perspective, but I did have an awareness of my body. That is, I still had one. Off in the distance, I began to notice a hum and a pinprick of light. The sound began to grow louder, and the light seemed to be coming toward me. As the object grew closer, I noticed that it was a fantastic demonic creature surrounded by flames with huge eyes and teeth, dancing toward me, slavering and growling. There was menace in its gaze as it smashed its teeth and stuck out a long, slobbering orange tongue at me. I was riveted to the spot in the dark where I stood. There seemed to be nowhere to go to avoid the thing as the creature was advancing at an increasing speed, determined to intercept me. I stood my ground and closed my eyes, expecting to be engulfed in flames or devoured or both. Instead, I had an awareness of the creature slowly passing painlessly through my body, and I turned an inward eye to it, only to discover that the creature was laughing with glee as it melted through me. It exited with a pop behind me, and suddenly I was flying forward very fast through the dark. As I flew, 2 more of the demon creatures came toward me, displaying different colors but still fearsome. Armed with my knowledge of the first one, I allowed these beings to approach and pass through me. Soon I came to the entrance of a tunnel in the black. The tunnel seemed to be constructed of gray, cloud-like material and wound far away and up to the right. Then it branched and I couldn't see where it led. From the branching on the right extended a yellow-white light that helped to softly illuminate the tunnel. I glanced down at myself and noticed that my body was gone. It had been replaced by a blue-white light, sort of equally limbed cross star, and it pulsed. This seemed natural and pleasant to me at the time. It was very freeing to no longer be attached to a weighty form. Looking back into the tunnel, I noticed there were doorways in both sides of the structure. A few other cross stars were wandering about in the tunnel, some blue like myself, some amber-colored. 2 other blue cross stars appeared beside me and gently propelled me into the tunnel. I floated along and up, observing that some doorways were open while others seemed to have been shut. The first doorway I peered into resembled a classic hell. There was a sound of shrieking and agonizing screams. Naked human beings were strewn about a blasted landscape with pools of bubbling excrement and jagged boulders. Devils and other animals were torturing people in all imaginable ways, and people were also torturing each other. As I neared the doorway to this sinister scene, I felt a sucking sensation drawing me in like a whirlpool, and I found myself flying above the miserable landscape. The smell was putrid and the heat was almost unbearable, but a part of me was fascinated by the seemingly infinite varieties of pain and anguish that was being inflicted on the inhabitants of this realm. Most of me wanted to leave, so I had no difficulty in my feelings that anyone could leave if they wished. I felt that no one or nothing had put those people in captivity except their belief in the agony they continued to suffer. I flew back to the doorway, which was clearly visible from everywhere in the hell. I left with nothing but joy, but I still had a sense of myself as part of that joy. The next doorway in the tunnel wasn't much better. As far as the eye could see, people walked on barren yellow ground with their heads down, completely engrossed in their own depressed, self-pitying thoughts, unaware that anyone else was around them. A great feeling of loneliness and isolation emanated from the scene, and I shied away from getting too close, although no sucking sensation was felt near this opening in the cloud tunnel. I flew along further up the tunnel and glanced in other doorways, but the next one that made a lasting impression on me was a world of almost indescribable beauty. I looked upon a beautiful wooded garden with fountains and waterfalls and streams and bridges that glowed and sparkled with iridescent colors. A close depiction of the beauty of this world has been captured by the artist Gilbert Williams, whose work I discovered several years after my NDE. A feeling of peace and harmony flowed from this scene, and I moved toward the doorway with a great desire to enter. As I began to go through the opening, my nose encountered what felt like plastic-wrapped webbing. I pushed forward but was gently rebuffed, and a voice said, "You do not have the information to enter this world." At the time, I remember feeling disappointed, but not judged as unworthy, just uninformed. I then turned my attention to the light that was glowing around the fork to the right. I entered into the light and was transformed by a feeling of utter absolute joy. There was nothing but joy. I said to the light, "I'm here," and the light said, "Great," in a voice that rang with happiness and bliss. I gave myself up to the bliss and learned many things that sound corny when described, but are truths for me that resonate through me now and forever. I learned that I am eternal, and though I may experience many forms of death, I will always know who I am. I have nothing to fear, only more to experience, and I am the one that ultimately chooses what I experience. It sounds hokey, but believe me, it feels really, really good to know these things inside yourself. Eventually, I became disenchanted with eternal bliss and decided to leave. I said to the light, "I'm leaving," and the light said, "Great," continuing its utter joyous and blissful existence, unaltered in any way by my presence. I floated back down the tunnel, glancing about me in continued wonder, eventually settling on the threshold of a doorway that looked into outer space. Pieces of rock floated by, and in the distance, planets and galaxies spun and whirled. A rather conflicting feeling of both serenity and adventure surrounded me as I gazed upon the silent scene. The entrance to the tunnel was nearby, and I could hear voices shouting, "Don't go, Sarah! What about Zane?" my son, who was 5 at the time of this incident. I grew annoyed at these voices because I wasn't intending to go anywhere, and of course I was going to be there to watch Zane grow up. Another being appeared beside me, and we talked about my options. We heard a voice say, "If you pass through this door, you can't come back." My next conscious memory was of lying in a hospital bed with uncountable tubes sticking into me and a respirator tube in my mouth. I was full of joy and humming with power, although I was unable to move any part of my own body of my own volition. I was also full of pain, and that sensation quickly oriented me into my physical self again. I have had to face many trials and challenges since my NDE, including complete loss of identity, disability, poverty, loss of friends due to their inability to understand how the experience changed me, and chronic pain. But the knowledge of the eternity of my spirit and the freedom from the fear of death have created in me a foundation of peace that no temporary physical condition can shake. I have a great wish that everyone could experience the wonders I have without having to suffer the trauma I did, for it would transform the world. My wife traveled to Atlanta from our home in Maryland to celebrate Thanksgiving with her parents. I flew home to Maryland, leaving her there to return to my job at the USCG Intelligence Coordination Center in D.C. On December 8, 2019, I finished dinner and bent over to place the dishes in the dishwasher. I felt my chest compress and grew dizzy. Thinking I was having an asthma attack, I went to the living room, turned around to sit on the couch, and passed out. I believe I died. I suddenly was aware that I was in a place surrounded by bits of light. I saw, felt, and experienced myself spread eagle, rotating slowly counterclockwise, while the bits of light were relating my life. The bits of light closest to me were my parents, grandparent, family, who all passed before, and connected to them farther away were close friends, and connected to them were people who had influenced me and whom I had influenced, students, acquaintances, etc., and the people whom they had interacted with, but unknown to me, but connected to me by my interaction with everyone I had known and met in my life and had gone on before. All of those bits of life were relating how my life and actions had affected theirs. A cacophony of words and stories, but each understandable and distinct at the same time. I was not feeling fearful nor distressed, but was actively engaged in hearing, not so much with my ears, but my whole body and my soul. I was not bewildered. I was accepting this as what was necessary, what I needed to do. I have no comprehension for how long I was experiencing this relation of my life. However, at one point, a brilliant flash of light, an all-encompassing light, and voice bellowed, "Not yet. Go back. Call 911. Whereupon all the bits of light repeated, "Call 911. I next found myself half on, half off the couch in my living room. It took me a few minutes to regain control of my body enough to enable me to sit upright enough to grab at my phone on the coffee table. After a number of attempts, I was able to get my phone, and again with a number of attempts and with great difficulty, I managed to call 911. Telling the dispatcher I couldn't breathe and was having a severe asthma attack. The paramedics came, placed me on a backboard and then a stretcher, and transported me to our local hospital. After a CAT scan, the emergency room doctor placed me on a hairpin drip and had me flown by helicopter to George Washington University Hospital with a saddle pulmonary embolism. I was in ICU there for 4 days, the first 3 of which I was forbidden to move, eat, or talk unnecessarily for fear of dislodging the embolism. I continue to wonder why I was sent back. On 3/28/2019, I experienced what I now know to have been a STEMI heart attack. I managed to drive myself to the hospital, where I collapsed at the entrance of the emergency room waiting room. I was found, loaded onto a gurney, and whisked to what I now know was the cardiac catheter lab. I was in and out of consciousness and struggling to breathe. A squad of healthcare professionals surrounded me, and various members took turns leaning over me to yell instructions and questions. Being unable to breathe, I was unable to speak. This caused the squad to repeat the same questions louder and sometimes nose to nose. How rude, I thought. I just wanted them to leave me alone. Suddenly, I felt better. I wondered how they did that. Not only did I feel symptom-free, I felt great. I felt buoyant, focused, and incredibly peaceful. My reverie was interrupted when I heard another guy in the room making groaning and choking noises. I wondered who he was and how he got in there. I decided to have a closer look, as I was mainly interested as to whether they were rudely yelling at him as they had been at me. I approached and looked over their shoulders, and sure enough, they were nose to nose with him, yelling, "Mr. My Name, Mr. My Name, stay with us, Mr. My Name." No way, I thought to myself. Here is ultra pleasant, and there is not. I'm staying put. It took me some time to figure out that if Mr. My Name was lying on that treatment table about 30 feet away, then who was having these thoughts and perceptions? The idea that I already had died crossed my mind. I realized that my internal dialogue was occurring in grammatically correct English, and that I was able to have thoughts, deductions, and decisions. I concluded that my brain's executive functions were intact. I decided to test my short-term memory. Sure enough, I could remember everything leading up to collapsing at the entrance to the emergency room. Not only that, but I could remember all of it in exquisite, vivid detail. I then decided to test my long-term memory and arbitrarily chose 8th grade. Immediately, I was furnished a rush of detailed memories. The sharpness and vividness of those memories quickly overwhelmed me. I wondered, where could all of that have been stored? I concluded that my long-term memory system was intact and that it was much broader and deeper than I believed possible. I began to get lost in the peaceful feeling I was experiencing. It was the peace which surpassed all understanding, and I wanted or needed nothing more, ever. I don't know how long I remained in this state, but I eventually decided to do a little exploring. Immediately, I found myself standing on a short grass prairie and gazing at the horizon. There were no trees, no roads, no animals, or any fences. It was just me and the endless prairie. As I studied the scene, I realized that out on the horizon was a black, cylindrical, horizontal cloud skimming along the surface of the land. It stretched out of sight in both directions. I felt the immense energy that was headed my way. I was fascinated by the cloud and got lost in it. Suddenly, I realized that the cloud was death, or at least my brain's symbolic projection of death. I knew if the cloud touched me, I was dead. 2 thoughts occurred to me. The first was that I couldn't understand why I still felt totally relaxed and peaceful. Shouldn't I be feeling pain, fear, or panic? A voice inside my head said no. The second thought was, should I be inventorying regrets and having a life review? Again, the voice inside my head said, no need. You do a lot of that back in the world. And that was that. I turned my attention back to the cloud and was surprised to see that it had gotten much closer. It wasn't touching me yet, but with a running start, I could spit into it. I tried to form a thought, but was utterly unable to do so. I took this as a sign that physical death was imminent. I felt myself entering the gravitational pull of the black cloud. At that instant, I heard a voice from behind me, just over my right shoulder. The voice said, "Where's the tunnel of light? Where are the loving dead relatives beckoning you forth? Where are the angels of light urging you to fear not and to be of good cheer?" The voice was compassionate, affectionate, and light-hearted. At that instant, I could breathe. I knew with certainty that I would live. I re-inhabited my body with a thud, a development one would think that would cause great jubilation. It did not. My first thought was, this thing feels like it's made of wet concrete. It must weigh a ton. I'll never be able to move it. How does anyone do it? Then I went unconscious for an indeterminate length of time and awoke amidst all kinds of electrodes and beeping equipment. The nurse happily informed me that I was a lucky man, that I had just survived a STEMI heart attack. My recovery produced some amusing anecdotes, but was surprisingly easy. As is suggested by the above, I had some prior information on NDEs because I had read several NDE accounts back in the 1970s. I never floated, I never entered a tunnel of light, and I was never melted by the overwhelming awe and unity of the universe. The afterlife and the experience of consciousness without corporality seem like givens. For me, the takeaway of my experience was nothing hurt, and the afterlife tenderly awaits your arrival. On June 13th, 2020, my father passed away in a nursing care center. I had no idea that my father was going to pass that day. I live over 200 miles away. At the time of his passing, I was in my backyard working with my husband building an extension patio. I was wide awake and it was the middle of the afternoon. I do not use drugs and had not been drinking. At the time my experience started, I had been shoveling gravel from the driveway into a wheelbarrow and rolling it to the back patio where my husband would then take over the wheelbarrow to roll it down a ramp into the lower patio. This event happened during a single trip from the front yard to the back. As I describe this experience, it is coming from two perspectives. I believe there was a spirit me that experienced and witnessed the transitional event of my father's passing from this world, and there was the human me. As the human me, I am reflecting back on the spiritual experience through a lens of analysis and trying to connect the dots to make sense of what happened. During this event, the human me was pushing a wheelbarrow and has no recollection of how I moved from point A to point B. The spirit me witnessed something else. As I was rolling the wheelbarrow past the maple tree, I was out of breath, so I stopped to take a quick break. I was standing about 5 feet from our maple tree. I recall looking up into the blue sky, feeling the warmth from the summer day. Something swept through me. A thought was spoken. What a beautiful summer day. While at the same time, I was experiencing an emotion of absolute joy. A transition of some sort occurred at this point. I can only describe the feeling as pure joy sweeping through me from my back to my front. It was as if a giant smile was pasted across my face. I vaguely recall seeing some sort of golden apparition smiling back at me. A reflection? It was so quick. There was an upward lifting sensation, and I also recall the sensation of my eyes rolling up towards the top of my head. Something changed so seamlessly at this point that I did not even realize it changed. After this transition, my attention shifted to the maple tree. The tree I was standing 5 feet away from now appeared to be more than 50 feet away. The backyard appeared to be stretched or warped. Even at this moment, it never occurred to me that anything had changed or was abnormal. I didn't even question how I moved so far in an instant. There was a man with his backside facing me, standing under the maple tree. At that time, I assumed it was my husband. I felt a little agitated at him because I left him in the lower patio and I was wondering what he was doing under the tree. I looked down at his feet. He was wearing jeans, a baseball cap, and a blue t-shirt. He did not appear as an apparition or a ghost. He appeared like a young, full-bodied man. During this part of my experience, I did not realize this was my father. I was about to yell at him, "What are you doing over there?" But for some reason, I did not. At another point during this experience, I recall wanting to take a closer look at something, and instantly, I was both far away and being right up to the backside of his neck, as if I were only inches away. I saw every single hair sticking out between the strap of the baseball cap. I can describe it as being up close while at the same time being in the distance. I honestly don't know whose hair I was looking at. My husband at the time was still in the lower patio on the opposite end of the yard. The man under the tree was obviously not my husband. I moved on to what I can only describe as the next scene. I still perceived myself as working in the backyard. In my mind, I was heading back to the front. I noticed a light coming in on the left side of this man. I remember thinking to myself, oh, a light is coming in, but I wasn't really impressed or didn't understand the significance of it. But I was thinking, pretty light. Then it was as if I was walking past the tree again, or my attention was redirected back on the light. This time I noticed something different about the light, like, you don't see this every day. It was a soft white and misty light. It shimmered as if it contained sparkles of light. There was a white clarity that is difficult to describe. I also saw colors and hues of light pinks and blues. The light was bathing this man on his left side, and it was absolutely beautiful. I just stood there and said to myself, wow, that is beautiful. I wish I had a camera. It may be worth noting that the sun at this time of day was on the right side of the house, while this incredibly beautiful light was coming in on the left. What happened next was the most profound part of my experience. I saw or perceived a robed arm stretching out from this light. I say perceived because for most of my experience, I can close my eyes and revisit all the vivid details, except with regards to this large arm stretching out of the light. I know I saw an arm at the time of my experience, but when I close my eyes to revisit the memory, I cannot see it except I remember the intense sparkle that occurred when the arm made contact with the backside of my father's left shoulder. It was as if a seam had opened up in my backyard and light was pouring out of it. The being emanated an intense light that was the light and was inside the light. The light was brilliant but soft. I did not see a face. At the same moment, when the stretched out arm made contact with the backside of my father's left shoulder, a bright sparkle occurred. At that exact same moment, I heard a voice inside my head saying the words with the most indescribable loving intensity. I love him. It was like an internal voice that was soft and whispering, I love him. It was not my thought, although it felt like it came through my mind. I understand now that I was being spoken to telepathically, the intense love being expressed through my heart while simultaneously hearing the thought, I love him, was so intense. I felt what I would describe as being crippled in love and awe. It was both an emotional and physical experience. I felt as if I was tilting my head into my left shoulder in awe, like one would do when witnessing the most innocent and beautiful thing you could ever imagine. At the same time, my heart just swelled in love. I believe now that I was truly sharing my father's death experience in these moments. When the light being made contact with his left side, my heart on the left side literally swelled with love. I felt it as a physical sensation. I responded, I would never say that. I understand now that my response was because I recognized this expression of love moving through me was not coming from me. I was confused. I spoke the truth. This love was so intense and parental in nature. I never felt that love before. I don't think it exists here on earth in that form. The closest thing that resembled that love was the love I experienced after giving birth to my children, but the feeling was magnified. Was I supposed to love like that? When those words, I would never say that, came from my mind, I felt ashamed. I realized at that moment my soul or spirit was bare and open. There were no boundaries and nothing was hidden. There was no fear, just a bit of shame, but the shame was quickly whisked away. At some point, I was no longer looking at my father. Maybe he wasn't there anymore and my full attention was on the light. I was mesmerized by the beauty, the colors, the love, and the awe. I saw what looked like soft dandelion seeds floating and reflecting the light. Although they could have been bugs in my backyard, I remember them dancing in the light. I also saw something more solid in the light. It was a brilliant gold color, and it had a more fluid and solid density to it. I was trying to figure out what it was. Instantly, as if I moved by thought, I recall being inside what I describe as the center of a sphere of soft, white, static-like energy, like the television snow, but finer. Windows were all around inside the sphere. The edges of these windows blended in the sphere of static white. The window in front was playing a high-definition, hyper-real movie. The man in this movie was absolutely the backside of my father walking towards an old house. He was still wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a baseball cap. The man whose backside was facing me in my backyard was the same man that I was watching in this movie. This is the first time I recognized my father, and he was a younger version of himself. He was walking towards a house in green grass. The house had a whitish-yellow wood siding, although I never saw anyone else in this window but my father. I could hear a child giggling, and I could hear people laughing. I connected emotionally with the giggling child. It felt like a memory, but it is not a memory I recollect. It felt like someone was chasing the child, like when you play tag. The windows on the sides of the sphere I recall were blotted out, black and white blurs. Whatever was playing in those windows, I could not see. The next thing I recall was the sensation of dropping the wheelbarrow down by the lower patio where I left my husband working. My physical vision was black but being blotted back in quickly. There was a tug or a pull. It felt like soft sand was being poured into the top of my head, and it tickled the back of my eyes. When my physical vision was completely restored in seconds, I saw my husband in the lower patio where I had left him. My first thought was, if my husband is in the patio, who is under the tree? I sat down on the patio and I kept staring at the tree. I said to myself, what just happened? Something happened. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I know I saw someone under the tree. I still had this echo of the child giggling and a very strong sense of deja vu. I felt heavy, like a weighted burden, gravity. I was trying to plug into reality. I thought, did I mistake the barbecue grill for a person? Was I daydreaming? At that moment, I could not recollect the details, just fragments. I sat there puzzled. All I recalled at that moment was that I saw a man under the tree, but no one was there. There was only the essence of a lingering memory of a panic and the giggling child. Eventually, I just shrugged it off and went back to work. Oddly, I was full of energy and I even worked out my husband. It was late in the evening. We decided to call it a day, and that is when I noticed my phone had been blowing up with messages from my brothers and sisters. I did not get to read them because at the same moment my brother called me and said, "How are you taking it?" I told him that I did not know what he was referring to, but that I am assuming our father is passed. We talked for a while. I took a shower and ate a small dinner. Later, I was alone and reflecting on the day. I read through the text messages and then thought about what I was doing when my father passed. Then it all came back to me. Everything in every detail. I remember everything I described above. I was so elated, I started telling my husband and other family members. All I kept saying was, I'm not special, but I saw Dad go to heaven. I now have a million new questions about life. I don't know if this experience was just for me. I understand clearly that I am not any more special than anyone else, as we are all loved and all special. What I do know is that when other people shared their experiences, I felt validated, that I wasn't losing my mind or alone. There are many events and dreams in my life that occurred prior to this experience. I refer to them now as guideposts or synchronicities, and many that occurred after. This experience was significantly different because I was wide awake and it was the middle of the afternoon. I now pay close attention to everything in my life. I don't believe any of it is by accident or by coincidence. I had been in a deep coma for 18 hours with no brainwave activity, and my heart had stopped working on its own. I had a living will in place, and the medical staff informed a family member that there was no chance of making a recovery and that it was time to turn off the machines. I was told later, after they had turned off the machines and had taken out the tubes, that I took one deep breath and regained total consciousness 5 minutes later, wanting to know if I could go home. Spiritually, this wasn't my first time having an NDE. The feeling of going home was there. That was the whole point. I cannot relate this from a memory point of view. If the brain has no activity, then the mind is dead. What is left? Conscious awareness. I went to where I've always gone on every NDE I have ever had. For the sake of argument, let's call it the center of the universe. I have worked at turning duality into one energy for a long time. Marrying knowledge and logic to the intangibles, love, creativity, and imagination into one energy called conscious awareness wisdom, and integrating that energy into my own spirit. I am there testing out that energy described above. There are other light bodies illuminated in different colors and of differing shapes and intensities. I began to experience an energy I know all too well drawing near. I tried my best to ignore the energy. but creator slash God slash great spirit is a little hard to ignore. Creator slash God slash great spirit said to me, "You're going back," exercising my free will and choice. Yes, I have that kind of relationship with creator slash God slash great spirit that I feel just fine talking back. I said, "No, I'm not." They said, "Yes, you are. I have stuff for you to do." With that, a bolt of energy came out of the energy form and zapped me. I often meditate on that moment that the bolt hit me. It takes me back to the moment when the Creator and I were one. I had the sensation of falling back through the black void to a small dot of white light screaming, "Define stuff!" 9 months earlier, I spent 7 days in a coma due to a depletion of potassium. I was taken off life support then. The only awareness I came back with was to write 3 essays answering the questions, who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? Wrote the essays and graduated from the human experience, or so I have imagined. I have recovered 100% physically and mentally. I have no ill effects from either experience of being taken off of life support. I was visiting a friend with muscular dystrophy in Lake Tahoe. Barney was in a wheelchair accompanied by his brother and friends. I had met Barney a short time before at a camp where I had been living. Barney had called me and invited me up to visit with him and his brothers in Lake Tahoe. I said yes and booked a flight. After a couple of days, things were getting a little boring and I needed some outside time. Barney was not able to get around, so the time was spent mostly inside. His brothers had been playing outside and invited me to come join them. They had tied a rope around the bumper of a car and were pulling their friend in a snow saucer across the snow-covered road. Laughing and giggling, they were having a great time. All of a sudden, the young boy they were pulling went out of control. As I was watching, I was horrified and immediately made a declaration into the universe. "Oh God, don't let that happen to him. I know he won't survive the accident." He was heading for a parked car and I knew it wasn't going to be good. At that moment, he rolled over, bruised his shoulder, got up, and walked away. The following day, I found myself doing exactly the same thing. It was in the late afternoon, and Barney's brothers asked me if I wanted to go at it. Not thinking about what had almost happened the day before, I said sure. I sat down cross-legged in the snow saucer and held onto the rope. The boys piled in the car and began to pull me through the snow. As I was being towed, I said, "Go faster." And at that moment, a voice came in my head and said, "We'll show you where go faster gets you." The boys turned off to the right, and I swung out to the left towards a parked car. I was moving at a rate of approximately 30 miles per hour. A voice came in my head and said, "You better turn your head or you will hit the car face on." So I turned my head and took the impact to the left side of my head. Oh God, we killed Barney's girlfriend. What are we going to tell him? I left my body and went into an aura of all white. It was totally warm and peaceful, pure love emanating through me and around me. At that moment, my grandfather, who had passed away earlier that year, appeared to me and we embraced. "My darling, you have a decision to make." I knew the decision was to stay or to come back. At that moment, I had an opportunity to view my life. Everything seemed whole and complete. I knew my dog and cat would be taken care of, and I was pretty much willing to go, but I had some questions to be answered. I asked if there would be anything wrong with me if I chose to come back. A voice answered no. The only thing that would show would be the scar of the tracheectomy. Would I remember this dream? The voice came back, yes. And if anyone would ask you about the scar, it would be an opportunity to share your experience. If I chose to stay, what would be the cause of death? It will show that your spinal cord had been severed. If I stay, what will become of me? You become light. At that moment, a highway patrolman showed up by my side. My brother was in the highway patrol, so I immediately recognized the uniform and came back into my body. I told him, "I'm having this incredible dream." He said, "No, you hit the car." I wanted to tell him about this out-of-body experience I was having, but he brought it back down to a physical level. With that, I wasn't interested and went back out of my body. Soon the ambulance showed up, rolled me over, and put me inside the ambulance and rushed me off to the hospital. On the way, I remember sitting up out of my body and looking out the ambulance window. I remember marking to myself, oh, there is Lake Tahoe, and I have a ticket to fly. So once again, I was out of my body looking over Lake Tahoe from above. The ambulance pulled into the hospital, wheeled my body into the emergency room, and I remember them asking about emergency contact numbers. I came back into my body and tried to give them the phone number of my mom, but I then started throwing up. There was blood and yuck and grossness all over me, and I didn't want to hang around for that. So once again, back out I went. When I finally came back into my body, I was sitting up in my body on the operating table. I was looking over my left shoulder, watching the doctors do the tracheectomy. When they finished, I lay back down in my body and resumed my life. Now getting back to the point as to when I made my decision to come back. It was toward the end of the dry season, and my platoon was pulling out. Our mission was simple: drive down the road, show the flag, and make sure that we still had the right-of-way. The two slowly moving trucks in front of mine were already kicking up the pulverized dirt road into little clouds of dust. Lady, the platoon mascot, trotted alongside, wagging her tail. She no longer went with us ever since a mine had blown up the track that she had been riding on. I exchanged my cloth hat for a helmet, put on my wire-rimmed sunglasses, and half-cocked the .50 caliber machine gun as we passed through the base camp gate and picked up speed. Lady stopped a few feet beyond the gate and watched us go. Our 4 tracks soon achieved a monotonous but comfortable 40 miles per hour, which created a welcome breeze. To either side of the road for mile after mile lay a gridwork of rice paddy dikes dividing the land into tidy rectangles of various sizes. The pale yellow stubble of last season's crop failed to hide the earth in the fields. Separated by cracks an inch wide, the clay soil of the paddies had dried into flagstone-sized blocks. Although the land was flat, the fields did not extend far into the distance, but rather ended abruptly at the ubiquitous woodline. This woods was composed of thick, lush green nipa palm and stood from 20 to 30 feet tall. From no place in the Mekong River Delta could one escape from being completely surrounded by it. Sometimes it might be a couple of miles away, and at others only a few hundred feet. It grew where the Delta distributaries were, and they, like a root system, were everywhere. We controlled the larger towns and villages, the road, the skies, the major waterways, and the rice paddies. The wood line belonged to Charlie. With diesel engines roaring and trailing a huge mile-long cloud of dust, the column began to approach one of the spots where the dreaded jungle wall squeezed in on the road from both sides. Instinctively, I began to watch the wood line more closely. All of a sudden, a very large anti-tank mine was command detonated 8 feet directly beneath my lil' old lily-white ass. I immediately knew what was happening, because my truck had been blown up before just 3 weeks prior to this. And I thought to myself, oh shit, here we go again. I was catapulted upwards along with everyone and everything else. People, dust, weapons, ammunitions, helmets, and sea ration boxes formed an expanding inverted cone with myself in the middle. On the journey upward, external time decelerated. The rates of the rotations of all of the objects surrounding me rapidly decreased, in an apparent violation of the law of conservation of angular momentum. I was fascinated by the unnatural, ever-slowing gyrations of the bodies of my comrades and wondered, is this the end? Are we all dead? At the apex of my trajectory, time stopped completely and an inexplicable calm descended. The state of consciousness that then prevailed was as to the normal waking state is to a dream. Whatever it was peaceful, omnipresent, omniscient, and absorbed everything into an indivisible whole. The entire universe, past, present, and future, collapsed down to a single center upon which everything depends for its existence. It is that which does not change. It is the light of pure consciousness which illuminates all things. It is the ultimate meaning of the enigmatic biblical passage, "The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light." It is the great nothing, for it includes all things, and therefore is itself not a thing. That's how it gets to be the all in all. Furthermore, there was, and still is, absolutely no doubt as to its authenticity, any more than one would doubt upon awakening from a dream, that the waking state is real, and that the dream was just a dream. In short, God himself took over my reins in the sense that I no longer existed as a distinct entity. Only he exists. There was an overwhelming feeling of bliss, love, compassion, and strangely enough of a sense of déjà vu. The knowledge obtained that the true home and the true self of all things had been miraculously revealed. The events of my life up to that point were unhurriedly and non-judgmentally reviewed in great detail, not in chronological order, but somehow all at once, although some events were emphasized more intensely than others. Subsequently, I was allowed to exist again. There was no choice in the matter, it simply happened, and was given the opportunity to be aware of anything that I wanted to be aware of, with the understanding that time was not a factor. Indeed, there was all the time in the world. I proceeded to focus on this or that aspect of my life and concluded that there wasn't too much to be ashamed of. Actually, I made extremely poor use of this gift, but then I was just a naive 22-year-old with a somewhat skewed concept of relative importance. I could see a 360-degree panorama of the road, the wood lines on either side, and the other 3 tracks of my platoon, 2 in front and 1 behind us. The entire episode seemed to be housed in my head, but I was uncertain whether or not my head was still attached to the rest of my body, although, under the circumstances, this point did not seem important one way or another. In other words, I really didn't care if my life was to be snuffed out or not within the next few seconds. I was then gently but unequivocally informed that I would survive the explosion without serious injury, and even that I would make it out of Vietnam in one piece. So, selfishly, I turned my attention to the immediate situation and very calmly and deliberately concluded that I should 1. Stay conscious as to not drown in 2 inches of rice paddy water, 2. Stay loose so as to break as few bones as possible, and 3. Roll away from the truck so that it wouldn't crush me to death if it tipped over. Only after my mind had run out of things to decide on did time start to rush back in. The transcendental state of consciousness terminated, and I reverted back to the normal waking state. I could see the ground about 20 feet below me and began to fall towards it. I was left with an intense feeling of awe and well-being. Ever since, I have been convinced with a conviction that precedes even my conviction that 2 + 2 = 4, that God is for me. It is no longer a matter of faith or belief, but rather one of knowing for sure because I have seen him as he is. However, it was a pleasant surprise to discover that he is loving, compassionate, and forgiving, properties which I had not previously made adequate allowances for. I will always be thankful to him for reaching down and picking me up in the palm of his hand, so to speak, at that particular instant. In fact, it still brings tears of gratitude to my eyes even as I write this 30 years later. Also, I no longer fear death. Pain and suffering, yes, but not death itself. Because by his grace, this particular raindrop remembers the ocean from which it comes. Unfortunately, the experience of this state is up to God, not down to us. But take my word for it. It is always here and now, and a lot closer than you think. I have never experienced anything before or since which came anywhere near close to being as real and as profound as the state of consciousness which I have feebly attempted to describe. However, my remembrance of it has sufficed to console and comfort me through the vicissitudes of life, especially through the hard times. Sorry, I have not noticed any paranormal or psychic or supernatural abilities with respect to myself, just an unshakable conviction in the reality of something spiritual. If you ever run across a surefire method for reawakening this state within me without blowing me up or telling me to meditate on Om for 30 years, please let me know. May God go with you. He will anyway, but it's a nice thought. I was unable to swim when I was pushed into a pool at the deep end. I sank like a rock when I touched the bottom of the pool. Myself, as I call it, came out of my body. I was instantly up and to the right of my body behind the right shoulder. I was very aware that the body I saw drowning was mine, yet I had no sympathy for it as I watched it drown and struggle for life. I was completely unattached to it. I questioned immediately how I can be there and here at the same time. I put my hands out in front of me and touched them together. As I felt the touch and recognized that they were my hands, I could not understand how this could be. I took a deep breath and said, "Wow, I can breathe underwater." I was distracted by the voices of those at the poolside discussing the fate of my body as it drowned. I could clearly hear their words and was aware of their emotions concerning my drowning body, but I still did not care about it and returned my attention to the fact that it did not hurt at all to die. I was amazed at how much more real and vibrant the colors and light around me were. This is real, and that body there was just a coat I had been wearing. It felt good to be out of it. I felt free from pain, confusion, and all the heaviness of the weight of life on one's shoulders. My entire perspective on life was changing as fast as I could think. As I was basking in the wonder of it all, at the same time, the one who pushed me in jumped in to get me. I watched as she pulled the body to the top of the water. As fast as myself came out of the body, it went back in, and I was instantly very angry about it. I could now feel the experience the body had while I was separate from it. It had been terrified and angry, scared and afraid. I had not experienced any of that, yet now I was being forced to feel the state the flesh felt, even though I wasn't there with it when it happened. I never saw through the body's eyes. I could only feel what it was feeling about what had happened to it. I was also aware that nobody there had seen myself come out of me, and I could not say anything to them about it. It seemed that while in the body, it had priority and control of all my actions while in it. It had a strong survival instinct and was not aware of the fact that it is really okay to die. I then was aware that it doesn't hurt the self to separate, but it hurts the body very badly. The self can experience the body while in it, but the body cannot experience the self. It is completely unaware of its existence.